Here's an interesting statistic. 41% of all children, that's 8.1 million children, live with their mothers, but not with their fathers. Only 3% of children live in households where their fathers are present and their mothers absent. 21% do not have either of their biological parents living with them. How significant are these numbers in shaping child development? Well, I'm joined today by two child experts who will attempt to break down the mystery of modern day parenting. This is How We Cope. I'm Hugo Ribatika. Welcome to another episode of Cope, and I have with me in the studio Lisa and Claire. Ladies, thank you so much for being a part of this show.
Thank you for having us.
So that statistic just now, pretty interesting.
I think that's the harsh reality of the world that we live in and the country that we live in. And I think that many children are in a situation where they don't have both biological parents there to guide them and support them as they grow up.
So what impact does it have on a child when that child does not have both parents living with them? Is it a huge impact? Does it manifest in any particular way?
So I suppose ideally, in the ideal world, all children would have both parents, and the parents would be loving, the parents would be positive and skilled, they'd be building their children up in particular ways. However, it's not always the reality. I think that children living in a single parent home, if it's a positive environment, will have many benefits to that, right? So I don't think we can necessarily make blanket statements about not having both parents always being a bad thing.
Is one parent ever enough?
I think that we also have to remember that children are raised by not just their primary caregiver, but by the caregivers around them. So very often, although there might only be one parent, there might be aunts, uncles, grandparents, friends. So sometimes, although children are in a one-parent household, it's not a single caregiver that's with them 24/7 providing all the caregiving. And I think that there can be a lot of benefits that come from it takes a village to raise a child way of thinking, that children are loved and supported and cared for by more than just their primary caregiver.
So the one thing that we spoke about earlier is mollycoddling, right? Now, how do we prepare children for the world out there? Because it really is tough.
It is a tough world, and I think we want children to grow up feeling resilient. I think that's how they can best learn how to cope in this world where things aren't always easy, where they don't necessarily have two parents or even a parent to count on. And I think that what we want is children who are able to roll with the punches, who are able to say, get knocked down by something, because we live in the real world and the world will knock children down. And that they're able to resource within themselves what they need to get back up and to carry on. And in fact, to grow from experiences, difficult experiences, so they can move forward and benefit from whatever they've learned from the difficult experience that they've been through.
I think it's also important, Hugo, to think about and to maybe break down what we mean by mollycoddling. So overprotecting children can be extremely damaging, but not setting appropriate boundaries and boundaries that keep them safe and that allow them to feel that they are equipped to deal with the things that happen in their lives can be equally damaging. So it's important to just define what it is that we mean by mollycoddling.
I do find the one thing that's a challenge is drawing that line. I spoke to a colleague a few months ago, and we were talking about preparing our kids for the real world. And she said when her son was beat down at school, she advised him to fight back, to hit back where it hurts, right? To stand up for himself. Is this the right thing to do? Is this the right sort of advice?
Standing up for themselves most definitely is the right advice. If you're talking about hitting where it hurts as in a physical altercation, then that's not something that we would recommend. But certainly allowing children to stand up for themselves. How do we
deal with, we're going to talk about bullying, we may as well, because that's potentially where it stems from. So your child is continually bullied by the bigger boys or the bigger girls, or whomever it is, right? the school may not be in a position to correct that situation willingly or unwillingly. How would you deal with that, short of train your child to fight back?
So I think that, again, that there's the sort of physical fighting back, as you would say, and the problem often with that is that, and certainly from my experience as a mother, that children are often afraid to fight back in that way because then they get into trouble. And that's very true. Children also often say that, that's not me. I don't want to be like this person. I don't want to be a bully. Why do I have to then become something that is hurtful and that causes me pain and causes me to lose, ultimately, I suppose, respect for myself, just to be able to stand up for myself. So we would rather encourage children to learn to be assertive, verbally assertive, which is a very strong and direct way of communicating, and often takes the bully by surprise. So other children learn that you are not to be messed with because you will speak up and you will stand up for yourself in that way.
Now, is this a manifestation of low self-esteem, certainly in the bully?
Yes, absolutely. So as much as the target's self-esteem is affected by bullying and by situations where they are made to feel not good enough, less than, unworthy, useless, all of those things, I don't believe that you can truly be comfortable in your own skin, that you can truly have a healthy self-esteem if you are bullying someone else, if you need to pull them down, I suppose, in order to make yourself feel powerful.
Because that's what bullying is at its core. It's about making someone else feel bad so that you can feel good. And that certainly comes from a lack of self-esteem rather than feeling good about yourself. If you need somebody else to feel bad or to pull them down or to embarrass them or humiliate them in front of your friends so that you feel big and good, that comes from a low self-esteem. And unfortunately, bullying is rife today in schools, online. It's really something that we can't necessarily protect our children from. So teaching them to be assertive so that they're able to verbally stand up for themselves, put a boundary in place and say, I'm not going to take this treatment from you, becomes so vital.
Now, children obviously become increasingly difficult to deal with once they're bullied. But how do we preempt the bullying? What are the sort of steps that we take to prepare our children for the possibility of bullying?
I think teaching children to be assertive and to have a voice from as young as possible. I think for some parents, when their children have a voice, it can be seen as children who are ungrateful, children who speak back, who backchat. And I think that what we need to do is be teaching children that they are allowed to speak, they are allowed to have a voice as long as it's respectful. And that's a really, really big point. It must be, children must learn that when they deal with other people and communicate with people, adults and other children, it has to be done in a respectful way. So if children learn that they're allowed to speak up for themselves and learn the skills, the actual skills of assertion, so that they know how to speak up for themselves, whether it's asking for help, whether it's giving somebody a compliment, whether it's expressing to somebody that they want to be their friend, or it's standing up for bullying for themselves if they're being bullied. Having a voice comes from the same space of knowing that I matter and I'm important in the world. Not more important than you, but I'm important in the world, and therefore what I have to say is important in the world, as important as what you have to say. And that's how we teach children to begin to communicate effectively with their peers and with other adults.
You obviously raised something that's pretty interesting there, Lisa. I think it all speaks to the relationship that parents have with their kids, that whole parenting process.
Parents and caregivers.
Correct.
Remember, any primary caregiver doesn't have to be the parents.
And I think we can actually bring this whole discussion round back to your original question with the statistics, that how does growing up in a home without one parent, the other parent, or neither parent affect children? I think if children are being raised in a way that they understand their matter, that they know that they have a voice, that they are heard, not necessarily agreed with, right? Because ultimately caregivers and parents are the adults in the situation. They're the ones who need to be taking responsibility to set boundaries around communication and behavior and things like that. But that if the environment in which children are being raised is one where children understand that they are important, that they matter, that what they have to say matters, regardless of who is in that environment, it can be a very positive situation or upbringing for children.
And one of the things that we realize is that some kids are damaged. They're damaged because they don't have both parents, or they don't have one parent or the other, or there is a lack of love from a particular parent. Too often we hear about daddy issues, father issues. Enlighten us on what are some of those issues, what are father issues typically, and how do we counter them? How does the absent father or the non-resident father, non-resident parent still impact the life of his child to prevent those issues from happening?
So for me, it often goes back to needing approval from that parent, whether the parent is physically present but emotionally absent, or physically absent, or there and doing their very best, but despite that, the child isn't understanding and feeling that they matter, and that they are unconditionally loved. And I think whether we're talking about a daddy or a mommy, that can be the case, and that what ends up happening is that as children grow up, they become very, very needy of approval, of attention, of acceptance, of all of those things that come from the situation that we're talking about, and that it manifests in a whole variety of behaviors, which we would term then daddy issues or mommy issues or whatever.
Was something you wanted to say there?
What I wanted to say was, I think one of the major things that happens when there is a parent absent is that children believe it's their own fault, that parent is not there, that there's something wrong with me as a child, and that's why my parent isn't around, doesn't want to be around me, doesn't love me, doesn't care for me. It's because there's something wrong with me. And I think that that's one of the major things that then those children carry with them into adulthood, believing that they're not good enough, that they don't deserve to be loved, that they don't deserve to have the care and the support and the kindness that everybody else does, because there's something wrong with them. And these children will grow into adults who choose relationships where they're not treated well, who choose relationships where they might be abused emotionally, even physically. So what we want is, we want to ensure that the parents or the caregivers, the grandparents, aunts and uncles that are raising the children are letting them know that it's not their fault. That they're not putting onto the child any kind of guilt or shame for the fact that the parent isn't present. I think that's really important.
Parenting 101, this is Cope. We'll be right back. This is Cope, and we're taking a look at the issues around parenting. With me in the studio, Claire and Lisa. Before we went to the break, we were talking about the role of criticism in raising children. And I know, Claire, you're very passionate about criticism, or the right type of criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it's about differentiating between criticism and constructive feedback. So I'm certainly not one of those people who would advocate for only praise, only positive, because I think it gives children a very skewed perception of themselves and of their abilities. So constructive feedback is absolutely vital. And the difference really between that and criticism is that criticism will often target who the child is, whereas constructive feedback targets the behavior of the child, so their performance, their, the way that they're speaking, the way they've come across, that sort of thing.
Lisa, how do we draw the line between an almost projection of what a parent would have wanted to achieve themselves and didn't, but seems to be manifest in how they push their child and the amount of criticism a child receives?
I think that's such an interesting question, because I think that does happen, that parents first of all, they want the best for their children. And often they think back to their own childhoods and what they enjoyed and what was good for them and what gave them a sense of achievement. And they want to push their children into achieving the same things because they believe it will be good for them. I think the other thing that sometimes happens is that parents believe that their children are a reflection of their own abilities and skills. And so if their children...
And potentially social standing, correct?
Exactly. And so if their children live a predetermined life, it's going to reflect very well on them. And I think that's really tricky because children are unique individuals and they are going to want to do what they want to do. They're going to enjoy doing what they enjoy doing. It's not necessarily based on parents. So I think it's very important for parents to separate me and my needs from my child and their needs, and allow children to pursue their own interests and ideas rather than pushing their own a predetermined set path on their children.
I'm glad you raised that because for the longest time, we've always thought mummy or daddy or parents knew best, but they don't always know best, correct?
I think that's true. I think that parents are parents. So parents or caregivers need to be there to set boundaries for children so that children can grow up within a set of safe boundaries. That is what allows children to feel safe to explore if there are boundaries, as well as things about safety, like actual physical safety. You know, you can't climb that yet. You're not old enough, things like that, so that children are kept safe. But I think that that children often know themselves better than parents know who the child is. And that if we give our children a chance to develop who they really are, we'll get to see them as the unique individuals that they are.
But the challenge that arises from that is the problems that children almost always find themselves in. I mean, let's talk about addiction. Let's talk about drugs, right? So you give your child a certain amount of rope because they know themselves better than you know them. How then do you cope? How do you deal with those situations?
So I think values are very, very important, and that setting values within a family or within the environment in which the child is being raised is vital, and that is the parent or caregiver's responsibility to set those values, but also to give children the opportunity to understand them, to explore them, to talk about them, so that children aren't just subject to a set of rigid values, but that they have the chance to engage with them and to understand why those values are important, why the family does or the environment does hold those values in high regard.
So one of the problems that arises is when a child, let's say university for instance, leaves the sanctuary, call it the home, right, and goes into the real world, where all this stuff is happening. How can we as parents prepare ourselves or prepare the child for the unknown? Because to a degree, you can only teach your child or advise a child on stuff that you're aware of. But what about the stuff that you don't know?
And I think that's the key in terms of parenting and starting as young as possible in allowing children to explore their own surroundings, to stretch themselves, to cope with things on their own. I think Claire was talking earlier about overprotecting children and how if we overprotect children and we mollycoddle was the word that you used, and we put them in bubble wrap and we don't let them really experience the world, then as children grow into adults, all of a sudden they are going to be exposed to all these things and they're not going to know how to cope. Whereas if children have practiced from when they're young, coping with small things, stretching themselves as they get older, so that they're coping with the unknown when they're 2, and a little bit more unknown when they're 3, and when they're 10, and when they're 12, and as they get older, they learn the skills to cope with the unknown. They learn the skills to do things that are not in their comfort zone and to manage within an environment that's not necessarily the one that they grew up in.
I think also that as they do that, they have the opportunity to learn who they are, what their strengths and abilities are, and to actually learn to trust themselves, so that when they go, for example, to university or to high school or wherever it is, that they have a good sense of who they are and actually believe that they can cope, right? So that they've had the opportunity to learn to trust themselves. And I think also from a parenting perspective, that should parents talk to their children about all these things. So with a 3-year-old, I could see you were nervous when you got on that seesaw. What did it feel like? How come you decided to stay on the seesaw, for example? What did you learn about yourself? I saw that your balance is improving. I saw that you were brave. That kind of thing. So giving very specific positive feedback so children learn what they can do, and just having, opening the doorway to having conversations with children about situations where they might feel unsure, where they are learning about themselves, learning about the world.
I'm almost inclined to think that the process of parenting is about reading, investing in parenting beyond just the amount of time that you spend with your children, because there are a lot of things that you're talking about now that many people, myself included, may not be familiar with, because I just felt, as you said earlier, Lisa, that I love my child or I love my children and I'm doing the best for them.
I think reading, there's many great resources out there for parents. And I think also talking with other parents can be a great way of learning, what are you doing? How's that working out? What are you doing? I think it can be really important for parents to share and other caregivers to share with each other the skills that they have so that they can upskill themselves with parenting. Because I think that there are challenges to parenting, especially in today's world. And that the more skills parents have, the more they believe and feel equipped to cope with the challenges of parenting, especially in today's world.
Well, let's talk about a nasty little thing called peer pressure. Because in spite and despite the amount of parenting or quality of parenting that we do, there is peer pressure. That's a massive curveball.
Absolutely. And I think it's from the age of about 8, is that right? That the children actually begin to look to their peers for approval rather than to their parents. And obviously
when parents start being cool.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. And I think that obviously as children go into the teenage years, it just intensifies. So again, it's about understanding what is the difference between feeling that you belong in your peer group in that situation and needing to conform in order to be accepted, and that they're actually two different things. So again, raising children to know who they are, to feel comfortable in their own skin, to like who they are, raising children to understand the values that the family lives with, are all very, very important things to do, so that when children get into a situation where they're being pressured to do something that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with, that they have experience in thinking about themselves, in thinking about their behavior, in thinking about what values are being challenged in that situation, and then to give them the confidence and the skills to be assertive and actually stand up for themselves and in what they believe is right in that situation and what they believe will work for them.
And then I think, again, if your child has learned how to be assertive and stand up for themselves from a young age, it becomes much easier in those kinds of situations when they're older to be able to say, no, thank you. This isn't what I want to be doing with my time. No, I don't want to participate in that. I'm not comfortable with it. That's assertion. And the earlier children learn to be assertive, the more comfortable they are with it and more able they'll be to speak up if they find themselves in a situation that's uncomfortable.
Well, sometimes we have children that are badly behaved. How do you deal with it?
Discipline is really important. And certainly as we're talking about love and caring and all of that, we're not negating the importance of discipline. Children need to learn to behave in the world. They need to learn that there's social rules, that there's certain types of behavior that are acceptable and unacceptable. And I think it's what Claire was talking about earlier, where we need to, when we're disciplining, we need to separate the child from their behavior. So it's not you are bad. It's what you've done or the behavior that you're exhibiting is not okay. You need to behave in this way, as opposed to you are a bad child, stop doing that. It's very, very, that when we start to tell children that they're bad, they start to believe they're bad. You tell a child they're lazy often enough, they'll believe they're lazy. They're never going to let go of that. They're going to grow up believing that they're lazy and not even trying to do anything different.
With the instances where child behaviour is almost delinquent, we've read countless times where kids are pulling out knives, trying to stab teachers, never mind stabbing each other. All the time we're watching stuff on social media where kids are literally punching the next child. The process of managing that obviously has got to be different from just a rapping on the knuckles.
Absolutely, and I think in those kinds of situations, it's really vital to get professionals involved, because that is taking behaviour to a different kind of level than I think what parents are able to deal with. And I think professionals are there, counsellors, psychologists, play therapists for younger children are really there to assist in situations like that, to assist both the children and the parents in terms of coping with that kind of behaviour.
Until next week, take care of yourself and remember, together we can.